Hey guys, Darrell Brooks has a restitution hearing coming up in about a week. Let's look at what the law considers restitution and why it's a very limited way to recover money for harm done, especially, of course, when the criminal is broke, and also what other options victims have. Every state does it its own peculiar way, but some of the things that we'll talk about for Wisconsin, they probably apply in large measure to other states as well. But I caution you, every state has a different procedure and process, and what one state does isn't necessarily or even likely the same thing another one does. Let's get into it. Let's look at in the criminal system. He's still got a restitution hearing following his conviction for all the crimes he committed at the parade. And that restitution comes into play when a court's going to make an order that a convicted person pay money to the victim or victims. It's a very limited concept. For example, in Wisconsin, it generally only covers special damages. And that means things like out-of-pocket expenses. I paid the doctor this much. I had this medical bill or whatever. It does not cover what's called general damages, which is pain and suffering. You know, I want $10,000 because I spent 6 months in traction or something like that. It doesn't cover that. It covers out-of-pocket things. If you want pain and suffering, you can still get it. You have to go to civil court. And in civil court, you could sue for your out-of-pocket as well as your pain and suffering and stuff like that. And if the criminal has paid you your out-of-pocket expenses as restitution, that would just be set off if you got a civil verdict after the trial is over. That's how they do it up there. I don't know how they do it in every other state. At a hearing to determine restitution amount and terms of it, the judge considers the victim's claim. That victim has to prove that. That's on them to say, here's a receipt or whatever for how much money I spent. They can't just say anything or make up any number. Restitution is not punishment. It's reimbursement for out-of-pocket expenses, essentially. Then the judge has to look at the defendant's ability to pay, which, of course, in this situation is negligible, but still she has to consider it, and then the judge makes a decision. For someone in prison like Brooks, the ball then moves to the Department of Corrections because they hold the accounts for prisoners. It has authority to deduct money from those prisoner accounts, including from wages they earn, and that's not much, or gifts or money sent to them by people. But as meager as these sums probably are, consider the DOC caps restitution in with some other items at a max of 50% withholding. Now, other items can take it over that 50%, but not restitution. So restitution by itself would not result in Brooks losing all of his commissary or whatever allegedly he might have. I don't know if anybody's sending him money or not. So anyway, restitution involves money that's less than usually what the victim suffered, because you have to exclude all the pain and suffering. And it's also very unlikely to get paid based on a person sitting in prison making very little money and getting sent very little money, because they know half of it's going to be taken and given to the victims who they do not care about. Now, what if he comes into money? Inheritance from an idiot relative who wins the lottery. How about that? What if outside of the prison he strikes it rich somehow? The way to fully recover there would be to have a money judgment against him. Go to civil court and either get a settlement, which that wouldn't occur with this idiot, that results in a judgment, but sometimes it does happen with reasonable people. Get a default judgment, that can happen, or go through a trial and get a full judgment. Either way, get a judgment. Then if he comes into money, you use the state's judgment execution procedure to try and get the money extracted from him wherever it may be. He's not going to win the lottery probably. His family doesn't seem to be the luckiest people on earth. The only people unluckier are those who come into contact with him. What if he gets a book or movie deal? But a lot of people concerned about that. So what if some entertainment company wants to pay Brooks for exclusive rights to tell his story from baby scumbag all the way to the middle-aged scumbag he is now? Wisconsin has a son of Sam law. You've heard of that. It requires any such deal to be shown to the Department of Correcting myself, the Department of Corrections. And if it involves the accused or who gets convicted or a convicted person, that money goes into an escrow account. And it gets used to pay for lawyers first, of course, and second, money judgments from victims, and then restitution. It has even provisions creating liability for companies if they don't tell the state first. And it prohibits doing tricks to avoid coming under the statute. Justice. Yes. No. The original Son of Sam law, which you see quoted all the time on the internet, from New York basically had the same or very similar provisions. You want to do a book, magazine deal or something, or movie or whatever, and tell your story about how you felt doing this crime or what went on in the crime. We're not going to let you make money off of it. Trust me, I completely agree with that sentiment. However, the United States Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision 8-0, Thomas wasn't on the decision either way, but how often do you get a 0 on either side of the equation, said this violates the First Amendment. It's unconstitutional and it's void. The Son of Sam law. Did you know that? I feel like a lot of people don't know that based on what I'm reading online. Anyway, because the law obviously hits speech, this law is basically written to prohibit prisoners from, talking about what they did as a crime and being paid for that. It gets looked at very closely, strict scrutiny. When the state wants to burden speech, it has to meet certain tests for the law to be valid. It has a compelling interest, that the law is narrowly tailored to infringe speech to the minimum that it can for this compelling interest in this weighing function. So the court here said, yeah, the state has a compelling interest in helping crime victims gain restitution, but the law is not aimed at that generally. It's aimed only at money that prisoners get for talking about the crime. Now, the court had lots of issues with the law, but my last sentence is not only a problem, but also a solution. New York passed a modified statute that required basically the same actions of someone who's contracting with or has funds for a convicted person for any amount over $10,000. So it still has a new provision in it talking about, profits from a crime, which could relate to a book or whatever. But it basically says if you're going to be handing over more than $10,000 to a convicted person, then you got to let the state know first, or the victims board or whatever they call it up there. And then they may end up distributing some of that money to victims or other things, depending on how the statute goes. Now, whether some or all of that New York law could still be struck down in the future, I don't know. But it was changed to respond to the Supreme Court issues, First Amendment issues, that it was particularly aimed at speech. But when I read the Wisconsin law, it still talks about movies and books and resulting from the expression of the accused or convicted person's thoughts, feelings, opinions, or emotions on the crime. I mean, that's speech. That's free speech. Why didn't they rewrite this thing already? It seems to me like a problem under Supreme Court precedent. I kind of like what New York said in the second part of their new statute, which is if you're giving this convicted person a boatload of money for any reason, you got to tell the state first in case they have these other claims. It avoids it being just limited, as the court said, look, you can't just go after speech on the part of the publisher or the inmate really in this particular way. Why don't you just make it apply to however they're getting money? But it's not what it says in Wisconsin, at least in the Son of Sam law that I've read, and which I'm going to show on the screen. You can look at it and see if you think it's distinguishable from the original Son of Sam law that the Supreme Court has shot down, but which I don't think a lot of people know that. Anyway, I don't know that you could count on this law. Now, that doesn't stop victims from collecting money judgments. It just means you don't get the help of the state through this process. And there are, some pretty cool provisions for victims in that. But still, you could still go after the money, just like you could if he got it from the lottery inheritance or something like that. Bottom line, there's no magic answer to help crime victims become whole as far as money can make that happen. The system of restitution is limited in what it covers and also how much of it you can get at any given point. And even with broader civil claims, you can't get blood from a turnip. There are, though, two silver linings around this gray cloud. And the first is Wisconsin has a crime victim compensation program. It's pretty awesome. It allows victims of certain crimes, to recover out-of-pocket expenses, not the pain and suffering stuff, but kind of the same stuff we talked about for restitution, from the state, which has a fund that will provide up to $40,000 total for a victim. It's divided into certain categories and things like that. If the victim has no other appropriate source of funds for that, if they don't have insurance or the offender didn't pay or something like that. And that should be applicable in this case. I see they are going to appear at the restitution hearing. So you're supposed to apply for it within a year of the crime. And so maybe people have already done that, or maybe the deadline was extended here. I don't know. But there is that source of funds for people who don't have it otherwise. And also, I think a fantastic piece of this is that so many people from around the world donated a lot of money, including generous people on this channel who donated money when we were live streaming the sentencing to help the victims. And that's pretty awesome. No money is equal to what the victims in this case endured. No money. But it can help with life moving forward. And I feel that knowing it came from so many people who wanted to show they cared, that's got to matter as well. Thanks. Bye.